We're back. News with Suze. Tea time. Ready to spill the tea. Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah,
Cheers to surviving 2025.
Yeah, just about.
I mean, we made it.
We're by the fire in Dorset.
Yes,
Backed by
so
popular demand.
backed by popular demand indeed. A lot of amazing things happened this year, including you making your News with Suze debut. And now you're so popular that I'm worried that you might
Steal your thunder.
steal my shine.
No
It's
chance
News
of
with
that.
Suze plus Jamie.
Okay.
Don't forget that.
Okay.
So what should we talk about?
We're going to start off by talking about Iran.
Yes,
so things are happening in Iran, and it's kind of over to you on this one because I know you've been talking to some people on the ground. So tell us what's happening in Iran right now.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we're obviously seeing videos coming out on social media of protests in the streets. Unfortunately, we have even seen police forces opening fire. However, they seem to be really spread out. So they are across the country, but the actual protests in the cities are not necessarily widespread. And what has been the kind of tipping point has been, frankly, the cost of living and the hyperinflation. So the currency in Iran is virtually at this point just valueless, and middle class families have seen their livelihoods just completely cut in half over a matter of days. And so, of course, regime propaganda will say and has said that this is strictly economic, it's not political, but what we are hearing is people shouting death to the dictator and calling for change.
And when they say death to the dictator, who are they talking about specifically?
So they're talking about the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because Iran is a theocracy that basically cosplays as a democracy. So yes, they do vote for their presidents, but the supreme leader decides who gets to run for president.
But the president himself has been saying some halfway conciliatory things today, I think, towards the protesters, right?
Yes, so the president, Masoud Pezeshkian, he is a reform president, so he's not a hardliner. And if we have a question about this, which we will get to, and he has been coming out and saying that the will of the people needs to be listened to, which some are commending. The people who I've been speaking to who want change and would be open to that meaning reform, because there is this idea that the people in Iran either want the regime or they want the regime gone. It is more nuanced than that. There are people who would accept reform. And I am probably going to get in trouble by the diaspora for this because it's a difficult pill to swallow, but people want change. And at this point, there has been plenty of people claiming to be the ones who can bring that change, and that being one of those people being the former Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi. But of course, we've not seen really any movement on that front.
Why don't you answer the listener's question? I can't find my glasses, so you can.
So, will the Basij, IRGC, and others not suppress as they always do? What's the factor that needs to be different for the regime to topple? Okay, so really crucial. There have been videos circulating on Instagram. The algorithm is pushing this for whatever reason, of monarchists saying that Mossad is involved and Mossad is on the ground, and it's important if one is looking to support the people, it's important to remember that narrative does not help the people, because by and large the people on the ground want to do this on their own. Outside help kind of minimizes the effort and allows for regime propaganda to say that, oh, this is all instigated by bad actors. You know, we saw the Iranian president say on an interview on the Supreme Leader's website that we're at a full-scale war with the US, Israel, and Europe. they brought Europe into it as well, which I thought was interesting. And that's kind of preemptively saying, well, whatever way we need to respond because we're under attack. However, it's also a way for them to say these protests are not legitimate because people are inciting them.
Because
that's not true.
We were talking about this earlier, and I was asking you, wouldn't it just be easier for the United States to have regime change in Iran by supporting an uprising rather than by bombing Iran, which is the other thing that's happened this year? Obviously, Israel and the United States have been bombing Iran this year. And you were explaining why that probably wasn't the case for the reasons you just said, really.
Yeah, but also, regime change, when the US has been involved with regime change, it hasn't gone well. Also, if you're going to back a regime change, who's going to replace the regime? None of those, that doesn't really serve the US well. But also, over the summer, people were saying, well, the Americans and the Israelis are providing they're clearing the way, and they're providing for the people a way for the people to go into the streets and take back their country and topple the regime. Well, if bombs are falling overhead, why would a sane person go out and protest and topple the regime? Like that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so Trump was asked if if the US was going to do anything about Iran, and Trump did mention that he said this is a brutal regime and they shoot people when they go out and try to protest against them, and if they continue their nuclear program, they will act. There were some questions around the ballistic missile program. There's been a story going around that they allegedly are building chemical weapons for the ballistic missiles, but so far that is not confirmed.
Okay, so watch this space.
I will say, I do want to bring up one more thing. Oh, we have more questions. Did the 12-day war in June add to the economic woes of Iran? Yes.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah. But also, someone messaged me saying, and I wanted your thoughts on this let's move over to Russia and maybe comparisons, that Pezeshkian could be Iran's Gorbachev, which I thought was an interesting thought. But how would that work?
Well, it goes to your language about him being a reformer, right? So in order to have an internal revolution, if you like, that really constricts the power of the IRGC and the supreme leader, it requires on having a strong, moderate leader. And I suppose the analogy as to what's happening would be with what happened in Russia, where Gorbachev was elected as a reformist leader of the existing system, right? There was no sense when he first took office that the Soviet Union would collapse as quickly as it did. He was going to be a reformist. He was famously, as Mrs. Thatcher said, a man we could do business with. And then that moved very quickly in the space of around 3 years to actually the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I worry because, we talked up when there's been, the Women Life Freedom protests a couple of years ago. I think Iranian opposition leaders outside the country were very optimistic that would lead to the collapse of the Islamic leadership of Iran, and it didn't. And I think
it did lead to reforms.
It did lead to reforms, but the Islamic part of the leadership, the supreme leader and the IRGC, are very firmly still in place. So I think it's important not to, until there's evidence to the contrary, it's important not to overcook what might happen as a result of this. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about.
But I think one final thought on this, as I do, and I guess this is my hot take, I do think that it might be time that the diaspora, the Iranian diaspora, may have to think about, is there a world where reform is a palatable option? Because most members of the Iranian diaspora are just absolutely not. There has to be complete toppling of the regime, nothing remaining. And it kind of feels like, I really can't stop thinking about this Gorbachev scenario.
What you
Particularly
have to
because the
accept,
source
yeah,
that it came from, the source
yeah,
inside Iran who told me this, is someone who has been close to the regime but has come to the conclusion that there has to be change. And at one point, like it's interesting, like to talk to different sources inside Iran because, like, the ones who have the nuance, like you sort of watch the seesaw of emotions. Like when the bombing was happening in June, when Israel was bombing Iran in June, this one particular source, I was literally watching them go from, how dare they bomb us? What are they thinking? And it kind of created this, not necessarily like love of the regime, but like there is this sense of sort of like nationalism and patriotism
yeah,
that comes out of being literally bombed.
yeah.
But then when Trump called it, the immediate reaction was, what is Trump doing? Why wouldn't you just go all the way? If you did this, if you started this, why wouldn't you just finish it off and like take Khamenei out? So it's really complicated, and that's why they've been in power. They've been in power and stayed in power despite all of the sanctions and bombs and assassinations of the nuclear scientists, because they've played on this complicated nuances of the country.
Okay, what else should we talk about?
Russia and Ukraine. Trump's been busy at Mar-a-Lago. You saw Zelensky.
The Zelensky meeting went noticeably better than the one earlier this year, right?
I know.
But hang on, they had another better one. This isn't the first time they've met since the Oval Office meeting that went really badly.
No, things have been getting better, and of course, you kind of see the readouts and you think, okay, so this seems to have gone well. Zelensky seems to be relatively happy, but then you kind of think, well, if Zelensky's relatively happy, then that means Putin's probably not.
I mean, I think it's the nature of making peace, isn't it, that everyone is going to emerge unhappy. Like unless both sides emerge unhappy from the peace deal, then there isn't going to be a peace deal, realistically.
Do we think? I know we were like debating whether we were going to do predictions, but do we think we're going to see peace? Well,
I'm not at all convinced, because I think at the start of this year, if we'd done predictions a year ago today, most people would have said and did say, "Oh, there'll be a Ukraine-Russia peace deal in 2025." So I'm not convinced, but we're allowed to wish for peace while being sceptical that it will actually appear.
I mean, Trump really wants the Nobel Peace Prize, though.
He does, but I mean, he may yet get it, even if he doesn't deliver peace deal in Ukraine. But let's see. That's the other thing to watch for 2026.
Well, the Gaza peace deal is still,
but I think the question of whether President Trump gets the Nobel Peace Prize won't come down to has he actually done enough on the peace front to really merit it. The question will come down to a political one for the Nobel Committee and others about whether it's just easier just to give President Trump the Nobel Peace Prize and have done with it. And arguably, people have had it for less. So I think, we talked, the last time we talked about it, we talked about the preemptive President Obama Nobel Peace Prize when he'd barely been in office.
Yeah.
Or hadn't even got into office. So he just got into office when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I think sensible people could make a case for Trump to receive the Nobel Peace Prize next year. I think it's helpful to dissociate that from some of the wider questions around President Trump. I think just given the history of people who've got the Nobel Peace Prize in the past. But anyway, let's see what happens.
So much has happened this year. It's felt like 5 years in one.
So we're going to talk a bit more about Trump's year, because it's been just inevitably, it's been a year that's been dominated by the incoming second Trump administration. And I think we were talking a bit earlier about how do you separate out the kind of day-to-day hysteria over transgressive things that are happening in the Trump administration with some of the really big ticket stuff that's like a trend rather than an individual event. So we can look back at things just in the last couple of months, things like, renaming the Kennedy Center, or being rude to women journalists and calling the reporter piggy. And these are things that kind of take up an entire day's cycle of hysteria
Epstein
in
files.
American media coverage. But or in this case, the Epstein files, maybe a month of coverage in the American media. But there are some bigger things going on that have been constant across the course of the year. And I think the one that I'd really pick out is this very definitive effort to undermine the existing kind of Western alliance, the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic alliance between America and Europe. And that is something that's been really, really consistent from the very first days of the second administration through to JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference, haranguing European leaders with some justification about things like low levels of defence spending and really downplaying the future of the Atlantic Alliance, through to the recent publication of the National Security Strategy, which again had extremely alarming language about really talking down the stability of Western Europe in a way that would be palatable to people in the Kremlin. Just extraordinary to see that in a US administration policy document. And like right through to recent days, really, where President Trump, as far as Ukraine goes, places very little store by the objections raised by European leaders, although actually that's one of the few things that's pushing him to reach a fair settlement for Ukraine. So for me, that's an incredibly important trend story through the year. It's not just kind of the individual beats of it, it's just the fact that it's almost unthinkable. If you had low expectations at the start of this year about where the North Atlantic Alliance would be by the end of this year, we've undershot those quite considerably. It's been probably worse than we could have imagined or feared on January 21st when President Trump came into office.
Okay, but arguably now Europe is taking seriously its defense budgets. There's talk of potential mandatory service.
National service, including the UK. Yeah, but as ever with President Trump, he's not wrong. He's not wrong about everything. He is right. As I said this, alluded to this earlier. He's not wrong that European defence spending in the last 2 decades has been backsliding in an unforgivable and dangerous way, and he's justified in pointing that out. Whether the remedies that he's chosen to take are the right ones, well, that's a separate question. But he's not wrong, given what's happened in Ukraine and given the extreme alarm showed by other countries in NATO border on former Russian states, nervousness in the Baltic states. You were in the Baltic states earlier this summer, Poland, other places who are extremely nervous about Russian expansionism. President Trump, you may disagree with him, but he's not making a completely unreasonable point about the state of NATO defence spending. Things like the German army, which, is in such a terrible state it can barely deploy at all. It's entirely reasonable, I think, to point out that that is unsustainable, and Western European countries in particular need to significantly raise their defence spending. And here in the UK, where we're broadcasting from today, the government has pledged to raise its defence spending to 5% of GDP, I think, by 2030, which is, sounds a big number, but it's an awfully long way off. And what will the world look like in 2030? Who knows?
We will be surrounded by robots, for starters.
Yes. Anything else you want to pick out from 2025?
Arguably, Trump may have made Europe great again, accidentally.
Well, I think it's certainly true that European leaders are having to contemplate a future where they largely cannot rely on the United States for things that they historically relied on them for. And that may turn out to be a good thing in the long term. Maybe it's just the case that the Atlantic Alliance had a finite lifespan. I think it's been one of the great underpinnings of the second half of the 20th century that this was the natural order, that America and Western Europe in particular were very closely bound together in a security partnership. And maybe that partnership has kind of run its course, whether you want it to or not. Maybe that's just the case that even after Trump leaves office and another administration comes in, what's happened may weaken those ties so significantly, particularly the Europeans will realise that they could never and should never count completely on American support and America being there when they really need it.
So this year began with the cementing of, we thought, the US UK special relationship through our union as the American and British couple du jour.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have worked, does it?
Yeah, what are we going
They
to have
didn't.
to
They didn't read
do?
the script. The Trump administration have not read the script. Okay. Should we talk about Alaa Abdel Fattah?
Oh, yes, I
This is
know
a news story from this week. Okay,
this is one that we need you need to explain.
so Alaa Abdel Fattah is
Come in and explain to
he
our
is
audience.
a Egyptian democracy campaigner who was imprisoned in Egypt for I think a little over 10 years and has just recently, just this week in fact, been freed and returned to the UK. But he returned to the UK because he is a UK citizen, became a UK citizen in 2021. He's a dual national, Egyptian and British. He wasn't a British citizen prior to 2021. He was made a British citizen by the previous government, Conservative government, and brought back to the UK under this Labour government. And there's been a sustained campaign by the great and the good and celebrities and actors and politicians to get him out of an Egyptian jail, largely seen to have been a kind of punitive sentence for political dissent as far back as 2009, the aftermath of the Arab Spring. The complication has been that subsequent to him being freed, his historic social media activity has been published, and there are some really unpalatable things in there, particularly highly anti-Semitic remarks and remarks about Israel, which are highly anti-Semitic, but also just some really offensive remarks about Britain, about the police, about kind of contemporary events in the UK that were going on when he published these remarks, which were obviously before he went to jail. So they're like historic in the sense that they're like 2008, 2009, so maybe like 15 years old. So there's been something of a political row in the UK, firstly about, well, how come we, A, gave this person citizenship in the first place, and B, expended quite a lot of political capital to convince President Sisi to release him from jail back to the UK. And secondly, I think a wider discourse about, and this is something we've touched on in this podcast in the past, is like just the way that people talk about Israel in the Arab world and the language that is used and that is seen as quite routine and unremarkable in sort of social circles. When it's published years later in the glare of news coverage, it looks really, really problematic. And it is really problematic, to be clear. And because you and I were at a vigil after the Bondi attacks with the Jewish community in London in Parliament Square, just showing solidarity after this Bondi attacks. And there's no question that the Jewish community in the UK feel extremely under pressure. They feel insecure,
but it didn't feel safe.
And it didn't
I actually
feel safe,
did not feel. I mean, I was going around and I was filming and kind of getting a feel for the gathering because it was a Hanukkah lighting and a vigil. Like it would have been just a Hanukkah lighting, but it turned into also a vigil because of the attacks. And I've obviously covered tons of gatherings and protests and events, and it did not. I just kept thinking, I can't imagine how how it would feel if I was Jewish on top of how I'm feeling right now, which was like I literally didn't feel safe.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it was interesting that a number of different politicians addressed that vigil, and the public health minister from the Labour government who came, hadn't been planning to speak, but she did speak. And she was really roundly and vehemently heckled and jeered by the Jews who were present in Parliament Square. And actually, the representative of the Reform Party and the Conservative Party speaker were pretty warmly cheered. And I think that's just interesting because it shows that the security situation in the UK for Jews is a political issue as well as a security issue. And there is a sort of perception that this government in particular has sought to kind of excuse some of the violent inflammatory language towards Israel in the aftermath of the Gaza war for political reasons to do with the support base of the Labour Party in the UK, who predominantly have a wider, deep support in Muslim communities in the UK. Now, I think that's simplification. It's probably a bit more complicated than that, but that is the perception there. And I think this is why this particular story has really sort of taken off in what is traditionally quite a slack news period between Christmas and the New Year, that there is a perception that this government didn't do enough to check whether the person they were extending this huge diplomatic effort on behalf of was actually deserving of that support. But it's also complicated by the fact that it was the previous Conservative government who gave him citizenship in the first place. So although the Conservative opposition here in the UK have really come out and attacked the Labour government, I think their line of attack is slightly blunted by the fact that it was their own government and the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the time who led the charge to have him freed and also to give him citizenship back in 2021. So there we go. All that to say, an interesting story on a number of levels that touches on the language used by democracy campaigners in the Middle East. And I guess the moral is maybe the moral is a bit that, you know, both things can be true. He was a democracy campaigner and he held and expressed really unpleasant, unpalatable views, and that democracy campaigners don't come in pretty gift wrap packages every time.
Yeah, because wasn't it George Clooney found himself kind of putting his foot in his mouth a bit when he very proudly talked about how his now wife, Amal Clooney, was involved in advising on drafting the Muslim Brotherhood constitution in Egypt.
Yes.
Which, you know, at the time, I mean, I covered this revolution, and it was a democratic revolution. And if we're supposed to be about democracy, well, then that was a democratic revolution. But
yeah, and
obviously,
Egypt democratically elected a Muslim Brotherhood government, which was subsequently overthrown in a military
Hamas
coup.
was also democratically elected.
It's complicated, right?
You know, so if you're going to be pro-democracy, Trump was democratically elected. I mean, democracy doesn't necessarily mean, okay, I'm team democracy as long as
I get the result I want. Yeah.
Exactly.
But this takes us back to Iran. It's like you should be careful what you wish for a bit. It's like the idea that transition to democracy in Iran is going to be smooth and seamlessly install a reformist pro-Western government in Iran. Like, I'm not at all sure that's going to happen, right?
No. And also, you know, the fact of the matter is the Islamic Revolution in Iran happened also by the will of the people. Of course, now the people say, well, if we would have known this is how it would have turned out, then we wouldn't have supported it. But they were promised all kinds of things, which is why they supported the return of Khomeini and they overthrew the Shah. You know.
So is 2026 going to be a good year for democracy? Hang on, isn't it the 250th
it's the
anniversary
250th
of America?
anniversary of America. We are 250 years old. Do we look good for 250? I don't know. I mean, no, I don't think we look that great. I think we're a little bit of a mess. I mean, when we were back in Washington, it felt the vibe is not vibing.
There's some big elections coming up in America in November next year.
Midterms elections. So 250th birthday, midterm elections. Is Maduro in Venezuela still going to be in power because the U.S. has, for the first time, it appears, attacked Venezuelan land? There's been this hit on a port.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned Venezuela because that brings us on to our
segueing
effortlessly into our NP story, which was that I was going to ask you which your country of the year was, in the sense that you are trying to visit 100 countries before you hit a significant birthday, which is still over a year away, just under a year away. And you've reached 99 countries this year. So I think it's no secret to say we are going to get to 100.
Yes.
But we're just not quite sure which the 100th country is going to be.
This keeps happening. I keep hitting my challenge sooner than I'm expecting.
Anyway,
so then I'm like, do I need to up the ante?
No, we can't afford that. So the country that you picked as the country you visited this year, which you most liked, has a Venezuela collection.
Yes.
So why don't you just explain what
So I think Curacao was probably the most random country that I went to this year, in the sense that most people probably hadn't heard of it. And I ended up in Curacao because it was part of our
It was.
honeymoon.
Yep.
And of course, for our 6 month anniversary, we decided to go on our honeymoon to Market. And that was when the Iran-Israel bomb campaign kicked off and the bombing started. And I was going live from Curacao.
Indeed.
Before that, we were in Aruba. But Curacao is so close to Venezuela that it ended up in the headlines multiple times this year. We put it on the map, right? Multiple times this year. Politically, it played a role in getting the Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado out of Venezuela to Oslo to accept her award.
Explain how, because it's an adventure story, right?
No, you explain.
Okay, so she had to be smuggled out of Venezuela, and
yes.
part of the smuggling was to take a surreptitious boat crossing, because
yes.
it's only 30 miles from the coast of Venezuela,
yeah.
right? It's very,
Remember,
very close.
We saw the boats.
Right. You see Venezuelan boats in the harbour. So she took a surreptitious boat crossing from Venezuela to Curacao, and from there she flew, I think, to Miami, and from Miami to Oslo. So Curacao had a small but symbolic and important role in one of the big political stories from the region this year, which was her winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
And then, okay, I'm so excited about 2026 because the World Cup is coming to my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. So when I was a little girl, I promised myself that when I grow up, I'm going to go to every single World Cup I possibly can, which I have stayed true to this promise to myself, with the exception of 2014, where I did have tickets to all of the US games in Brazil, but then I ended up getting deployed to Iraq and covering ISIS, so duty called. But Curacao is playing in the World Cup. They are the world's smallest country to play in the World Cup.
Right, so we are getting tickets by hook or by crook for
yes.
Curacao. I'm just quickly Googling to say, what are the Curacao football team called? They're also called the Eagles.
Oh!
Hang on, or the Blue Wave.
The Blue Wave.
This is AI, so it might not be true. Anyway.
It's a problem.
Add to the comments if you know what the name of the nickname of the Curacao national team is.
I'm sure we have some soccer fans here. Oh, speaking of, another question to watch for 2026. Are we going to see the name soccer officially changed in America to football? Because we heard President Trump mention this. And we have seen that he does have a thing about changing names. He changed the Gulf. That happened this year. He changed the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America.
True. I think the NFL will prevent him from changing soccer.
This is gonna be one to watch. This is one to watch. We have a question. One existential question I ponder often is: have we, as the USA, jumped the shark? And if so, what does a high-functioning modern democracy look like? Ooh.
I mean, look, I'm kind of overall still an optimist, and I feel the second Trump administration is transgressive and breaking any established conventions in all kinds of ways. But I got to say, I still remain optimistic that American democracy is going to continue to survive and flourish, actually. I think wherever you are politically on the Trump administration, I think the underpinnings that America has are probably strong enough to, withstand some of the battering that's being taken. And so I remain pretty optimistic, but I could be completely wrong.
I agree. I'm optimistic. I think, you know what? I've been to 99 countries. I've lived in multiple countries, some of
democracies,
that weren't democracies. And when I come back to the United States, this year we moved back, I am so grateful. And I really think that, speaking of national service, I am one of those people who actually thinks that young Americans do need to experience the world in order to appreciate what we have and what our founding fathers, who were seeking independence from you guys, created for us.
Now, let's not get into that. The run of Hamilton at the Kennedy Center has been cancelled.
Yes.
So we won't be able to go to the box for Hamilton in the Kennedy Center in the spring because Lin-Manuel Miranda has cancelled the run in protest at the renaming of Kennedy Center. So there we go.
Speaking of arts and fashion and style, what were your favorite trends of the year?
I mean, it's probably kind of, I'm probably meme. I quite like the meme at the moment that says you put a picture of 4 places, you put 4 pictures up and say, Dorset is the best place on earth, not Dubai.
We're in Dorset, and that's his home
so
area.
Wherever you are, you put 4 amazing pictures up where you live, and you say. So it's interesting. Dubai's getting a bit of a kicking actually on social media.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Do we think someone's behind it?
Oh, possibly. Someone's behind most things on social media, so you shouldn't read too much into them.
Yeah. So I mean, for our viewers, I've covered this a lot. The kind of rivalry. It's more than just a rivalry. Sometimes it's much more than a rivalry. It's deeper and more sinister, between Qatar and the UAE.
Yeah, and Saudi in the UAE.
And Saudi in the UAE, but a bit more friendly. I mean, we saw the backlash of influencers in Qatar, like taking funds and trips and whatnot to Qatar, which when I first saw that, I thought, it's the UAE behind that. Could be, maybe not. Yes, no. And now we're seeing anti-Dubai content suddenly taking off. So
very interestingly, today the UAE has put out quite a robust response to Saudi Arabia's criticism of their role in Somaliland. Somaliland, yeah. And this is
and Yemen.
And in Yemen. And this is probably a story for another day. But it's just interesting that, like, the first time I can remember that the UAE Foreign Ministry has put out a statement directly rebutting something that Saudi Arabia has said. I just think that's like straw in the wind. Quite interesting.
Yes, definitely. Well,
you said yours. What was your favourite trend of the year?
Okay, so I loved. Obviously, we know that I love sustainable fashion, and I loved that Stella McCartney debuted plant-based feathers in Fashion Week. I'm not sure I love the fact that New York Fashion Week has banned fur officially from showing.
Right.
Mainly because fur is actually sustainable, and faux fur, one, is not sustainable, and the materials that they use is plastic, and that's really bad for you.
I mean, you're going to get some heat for saying that.
I know, but you know what? I am.
You'll die on that hill.
I stand by my statement. I said
what I said. Is that
I
the
said
phrase
what I said. But also, I mean, so one of our many amazing random trips, we went to Castoria, Greece, which is the fur capital of the world. And it was completely empty. And so all these people who live here and live off of the fur industry were really economically hurting. So I think like there needs to be a world where, and we have seen articles come out about, like indigenous groups talking about how fur is something that's been an art and a tradition that's been passed down through families and lineages for years and years and years. And so I think we need to find a way to be kind and humane to animals, but to also think about, one, the environmental impact, and two, the impact on some of these communities. Because my whole thing is we have people who eat meat and wear leather and then freak out about fur.
Okay, I think you should quit while you're ahead, because of all the things you talked about, Iranian opposition groups, President Trump, Venezuela. I think of all the things you've dug into, the ethics of wearing fur or not, probably.
Well, helmet to heels in it.
Okay, and on that bombshell, let's draw.
Hey, guess what? We didn't buy a Labubu.
No, we didn't buy a Labubu.
So the trend of the year that I didn't love was the Labubu and their demonic faces, and I resisted getting one.
Great. We'll see you in 2026. Happy New Year.